Welcome to The Western Standards, The Pipeline. My name is Paul Holmes, and I'm the digital editor with Western Standard. And joining me today is Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of The Western Standard. Derek, how are you?
I'm cold.
You're cold. And that's because you're coming from Calgary, Alberta, and I'm coming from the beautiful and balmy Victoria, British Columbia. Both west, but a little different.
Yeah, don't rub it in.
Fair enough. So, of course, this being our very first official episode of The Pipeline, I think we should probably start with an overview of the Western Standard and the relaunch thereof, which has been an amazing success. Why don't you tell the audience, or the audience on YouTube for the very first time, a little bit about where we're at and how we got there?
Well, about a month out from the federal election, I was looking at the math, and without patting my own back too much, I thought the result would be almost exactly what we got. And I had a feeling that the growing sentiment in the West, in particular the West outside of Victoria, would react very negatively to this. And my feelings didn't change. My feelings around Western issues are more structural in nature, don't really depend on what party or politicians in power at any given time. But I looked at the media landscape and the political landscape, and I thought there was a huge vacuum for an independent media source focused on Western issues that isn't owned or serving interests in central Canada or the United States, but that is owned and operated and staffed purely in Western Canada, focusing on Western issues that would provide both credible news on the news side of what we're doing, that wouldn't be into maybe some of the flakier stuff you see from independent media sites out there, but they would also couple it with a strong opinion side. So we recruited a great team of strong opinion columnists. But we also built a good news team as well. And so in our short early time here, we've had fantastic success in building a new Western Standard, on the legacy of the old Western Standard that I hope is doing it proud. And we just closed out our first full month of November with a hair under 800,000 readers, which when you take bounce rates into account, would, by our math, make us the third largest or third most read online news site in Western Canada. So for our first month, I'm pretty happy with that. And
yeah, it's not bad.
It's not bad. Yeah. We're chugging along. We're full steam ahead here. I'm not going to stop until we can buy the Toronto Star, which at current stock prices should be in about a month or two. But we've had a tremendous success here providing an independent media voice for Western Canada, not supported by any government subsidies. We refuse to take it, but supported by members of the Western Standard. You can go onto the membership section of westernstandardonline.com, become a regular monthly contributor. Because if you want to see this kind of thing, people have to pay to help keep it going.
Absolutely.
But I want to thank everybody who's done it so far.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, and for those who don't know the old Western Standard, their story, of course, they were a print magazine. They kind of formed from the ashes of the previous Western Report. I guess some of the same staff started the Western Standard, and then the became very famous with the publication of the Muhammad cartoons, and I guess shortly, not too much long thereafter, they stopped printing the magazine, and of course the industry was in a bit crazy amount of turmoil at the time. But any background or any sort of high points that you want to highlight, around the old Western Standard and maybe some parallels with what you're trying to put together?
Well, it was a different beast. They were trying to do print, and they maybe didn't know. I don't think they knew it when they started it, but they were starting a print publication at exactly the time that print was dying.
Yeah,
I don't believe print will ever completely die, but it certainly is not. The print industry is a shell of its former self. They were coming in just as things were moving to online, and they didn't hop on the online train fast enough. I never truly understood why they folded until I took ownership of the Western Standard. And I actually think they could have continued to make a go of it, but for one reason or another, they decided to call it a day.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember very fondly, I would eat ramen noodles a couple days a month in university just so I could afford my Western Standard subscription.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had about 6 months left on my subscription when it folded. And so I felt I needed at least 6 months more Western Standard. So I figured, why not just start it again?
Did they give you your money back?
They did not give me my money back, but I own it now, so I suppose it's
all right. Well, that's the best of karma, right? Right on. Okay, so we're going to cover the weekly national affairs, and we're going to start with some of the topics. The idea of this show, for those who are tuning in for the first time, the idea is that we're going to cover obviously Western-focused but national topics, and the big highlight this week, of course, is the Fair Deal panel with Jason Kenney and his trip to Ottawa and some of the topics around that. So where do we want to start there? Do you want to start with his trip to Ottawa and the outcomes there?
Well, maybe we'll start with the panel itself and its hearings in Alberta, and then maybe we'll talk about Mr. Kenney's trip to Ottawa.
And you were there for the panel last night.
Yeah. So it's this Fair Deal panel was struck roughly a month ago by Premier Jason Kenney. It gave it a mandate to examine a number of issues on Alberta, asserting its own jurisdiction under areas it has control of under the Constitution, but does not currently exercise.
Right.
And this panel's got a number of eminent people on it who have started out on the Fair Deal panel roadshow across Alberta. It's gone through Edmonton and Red Deer so far. I'm not sure if it's hit any others, but those are the two I'm aware of. And it hit Calgary last night, and we were on the ground. It was an interesting experience. There was a group. It's hard to say how many because it was a large room, mostly full, and there was a group organized by some unions to show up and have kind of wave the flag a bit, and but the room was overwhelmingly dominated by people who, to one degree or another, were all just competing to demonstrate the degree to which they're pissed off and want a fair deal. So the union guys would come up and they would say this. They had this bizarre thing. They would come and for people who regularly decry nationalism, they would stand up there and declare themselves patriots and say, I'm a Canadian patriot. How dare you? This entire exercise isn't just a bad idea. The ideas you're considering aren't just a bad idea. The exercise here is unpatriotic. Alberta doing what Quebec has done is anti-Canadian. But I've never heard any of these people, and I recognize some of them, I haven't heard a single one of them ever mention about how it's unpatriotic for Quebecers to rule in their own house, but it is unpatriotic for Albertans to do so. And so these people seem to think the entire thing is been struck to ferment independence, which is a bizarre idea. I think
isn't it kind of the opposite? Isn't the whole idea to try to affirm a better place within Confederation so that the independence, the waning Wexit movement doesn't sort of gain ground and gain
That's
steam?
exactly as I see it. I mean, these people they're essentially just touching a completely different side of the elephant here. They seem to think any discussion of Alberta getting a better deal in Confederation is somehow Alberta trying to leave Confederation. What they don't understand is there is a critical mass in Alberta right now that is open to independence. There's not a clear majority ready to vote tomorrow for independence, but I think there's a clear majority who are open to the idea. Quite a few are, I think, ready to vote for it, but I think them added to the middle group, the reformers, I'll call them, there's a clear majority in Alberta that if they cannot achieve a place of what they view as fairness in Alberta, are ready to move towards independence. And sure. I think Jason Kenney is terrified of this from a purely political and partisan perspective. He would be the direct loser of that because these people will be coming straight from the base of the United Conservative Party who voted for him to go and fight Ottawa, get this fair deal. And if they don't get it, there's going to be some hell to pay.
Well,
So,
and there's a legacy issue as well, right? I mean, Jason Kenney doesn't want to go down in history as the premier that allowed Canada to break up, right? I mean,
yeah,
who wants that on your resume, right?
yeah. I mean, so these guys are going around saying, "Oh, he's a closet separatist trying to become the president of Alberta."
Mm.
Look, I think I know him better than most people who are not in his inner circle, at least. And the man is a staunch Federalist.
Oh yeah.
I think he's Canadian first, Alberta second.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that he's not going to stand up for Alberta, but he is very much a Canadian Federalist. And the same people, the domestic left, I would call them in Alberta, they do exist. And none of these people have ever said there's anything wrong with Quebec standing up for itself.
Mm.
In fact, they almost facilitate Quebec independence if they wanted to. Like the NDP regularly talk about watering down the Clarity Act, make it even easier for them to leave. But if Albertans talk about simply doing what we're allowed to under the Constitution, respecting our jurisdiction, we're called traitors. So this is all not to stoke independence. This is to throw a wet blanket on it. And depending on what comes out of it, it might work, it might not. If this panel comes out and says, we're going to demand a Triple E Senate, we're going to demand constitutional amendments on free trade and market access, we're going to demand constitutional amendments to outlaw equalization, and then Alberta on its own unilaterally withdraws from a bunch of areas of federal control like police, pensions, etc. It might be enough to keep things in check here. But I suspect, though, that Jason Kenney knows he can't get a win from Ottawa on most of these things. And so he's going to he has been lowering the bar regularly here so that he could try to declare a win. And I don't think a token win is going to pacify Albertans who are demanding a feast at the expense of Ottawa right now.
So help this British Columbian understand a little bit better. From my perspective, Alberta affirming itself and taking the constitutional powers that have already been given to it as an entity. I can't imagine anybody on this side of the coast, this side of Alberta, thinking that's a problem, right? I have seen a lot of people ridicule the whole idea of Wexit or Albexit or whatever you want to call it, the separatist movement, and I've seen people, crassly do so, not understanding obviously some of the frustration. So how much of it is just political, where the NDP is not in power in Alberta? The Conservatives are trying to do this, to try to repair this problem, and so they're just knee-jerk going against what the Conservatives are doing because it's politically their opponent. Well,
as someone who's been in opposition MLA, I can tell you the instinct is to oppose.
Sure.
But I don't think the NDP is opposing just because they're the opposition here. I think there is a long ideological tradition in what they're doing. In Alberta, the left has always been outnumbered. The NDP are the only nominally left-wing party ever elected in Alberta. I mean, we had Alison Redford and Jim Prentice, who were ideologically moderate center-left, but they were technically Tories. But the left can't win elections in Alberta. And so it has, from the very beginning of Alberta, the left has always favored greater federal control in Alberta because for them, it's a way to achieve more ideological victories than they would have if Alberta controlled more of its own destiny. If Alberta is simply running its own way, it's going to be a vastly more conservative or libertarian political environment than it would be if it's sharing more powers with Ottawa, because Ottawa's center of gravity, regardless of who's in power, is going to be always to the left of where Alberta is. And so our NDP friends here, or liberals before them, have always been in favor of more federal control here, because not because they're necessarily more patriotic, but because it ensures better ideological outcomes for them.
I see. So institutionally, it's set up better for them politically.
Yeah, and you know, in other provinces where the center of gravity is not to the right of Ottawa, the center of gravity is to the left of Ottawa, leftist parties favor more decentralization. In
Sure.
Quebec, the left favors a lot of decentralization in many respects, because Quebec can do that on their own. Or in, you know, there's been cases in the 90s where you had NDP governments in British Columbia. Maybe you could speak about this, but governments in British Columbia that fought like hell with the federal government because when the Chrétien government was balancing budgets and whatnot, it actually kind of moved into the moderate center right. And yet the BC government would want to assert a lot more control over its own destiny, even though it was the NDP in charge there. Maybe you can speak about the British Columbia experience.
Oh, I still have trauma and counseling about the British Columbia experience. I graduated high school when the NDP was in power during the period where they went through 3 or 4 leaders all back to back with scandals and chaos. I have to say, ironically, and I'm you know, as you know, a pretty conservative guy, a bit of a stranger in my own house here in British Columbia, but I'm shocked at some of the things that the provincial government, the NDP provincial government, has done here in the province, including balanced budgets, which, you know, if you'd asked me when they got elected, would there be balanced budgets for the next few years, I would have said absolutely no way that's going to happen. So they've maybe learned the lesson from the past and recognized that if they have a hope of staying in power, they can't just, you know, do what they did in the 90s and go on wild spending sprees.
But yeah, a lot of these central versus decentralized decisions are ideologically informed. Although I do think in Western Canada, there is just a natural, in Western Canada and in Quebec, there is a knee-jerk default position towards decentralization. But in Alberta, it has a very strong ideological strain because, as I said, if Alberta is left to its own devices, it will almost always come to a more conservative outcome than if it has to share power with Ottawa.
And Ontario is the center, so it doesn't matter. And in Atlantic Canada,
Ontario doesn't care because it controls the federal government anyway.
Yeah, and in Atlantic Canada, they just want things to go nicely. Yeah,
everyone favors living at home when your parents are rich.
That's right. All right. So, Fair Deal panel, was there any specific policy items that you think are worth highlighting, some of the things that kind of stood out?
I mean, the biggest cheers in that crowd were very clearly for people who stood up and were whole hog sovereignty. That got the biggest cheers. That being said, and you know, there were quite a few, I think, independent supporters in that room. That being said, many people who were not yet on that independence train, I think, were cheering for them as a way of just expressing frustration.
Sure.
You know, they would not. I don't think they would be. Many of those would not be considered sovereigntists right now.
Right.
But I'd say the dominant vein of thought in that room, if I was to take the aggregate, if that was possible, the aggregate thought was the Fair Deal panel better get a fair deal fast. And if Alberta can't get a fair deal, then those people who are in the Federalist reformist camp have said pretty clearly that they're prepared to support independence. If that rubber ever meets the road, we won't know. But this will involve Alberta unilaterally doing many of the things that it can without permission from Ottawa. That is RCMP, withdrawing from the RCMP, withdrawing from the Canada Revenue Agency, withdrawing from the Canada Pension Plan, a lot of these things. Yeah. But it's also going to require Ottawa to reciprocate on Senate reform, on equalization, on market access, and maybe we can turn towards that now. But I don't think Ottawa is going to bite.
Well, a lot of those things have been talked about for decades. You know, Senate reform is a fantastic example, right? It's been bandied about. I mean, the Liberals now, what they nominally place nonpartisan people in the Senate, and that's considered to be their resolution for the Senate. I can't see a world where we have a triple E Senate, if you will, in the classic Preston Manning form, without opening up the Constitution and all of the chaos that is
Oh,
involved.
it would clearly require constitutional reform, and no party, even one as bold as, say, the PPC, is not prepared to open the Constitution. Because, I mean, if you open the Constitution, you look in that little box, you'll see Brian Mulroney still crying in a corner. It happened. It is very dangerous.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, all of these solutions we're talking about, repealing bills C-48, bill C-69, equalization, rebates, that bullshit term, all of these things, these are Band-Aid solutions and one-off. They're not going to fix the structural problems in this country unless there is constitutional reform.
Yeah,
it's necessary. But there is no way in hell we're ever going to get constitutional reform. But I think it's worth trying before we go whole hog sovereignty.
So do you think that if they were able to deal with some of the, quote, low-hanging fruit, some of the bills that you mentioned, perhaps the Alberta pension plan, some of, the Alberta provincial police versus the RCMP, if some of those things were to take shape, relatively quickly, would that be sufficient, do you think, amongst the moderate sovereigntists, if you will, to quell them a little bit and perhaps, make them a little more patient to maybe a longer process of constitutional reform? The problem with the Constitution is, Alberta thinks it just needs to go this way, and there's very strong voices in Canada that think it needs to go, exactly the opposite way. And it terrifies me, actually, to think that we open up the Constitution and we end up with something far worse, right?
Well, I'd say if we open up the Constitution, we get something worse. It'd be very clear that the only option is independence at that time.
Well, I suppose, yeah. Anyway, do you think that there's an appetite in Alberta amongst not obviously amongst the hardcore, but amongst the dispossessed masses, if you will, that some of these things happen? Yeah.
So Jason Kenney has built his provincial political career building a case against Ottawa, and he built a very good case, and I think a legitimate one. It made him PC leader, it made him UCP leader, and it's made him premier. Mm-hmm. I think he's terrified right now, though, that this fire that he's been fanning is out of control, and it could come back to burn him unless he gets it under control and finds a way to satisfy that fire. And so we'll take, for example, the issue around this equalization referendum everybody's heard about. When he ran for UCP leadership, he said there's going to be a referendum on equalization, period. And in Alberta, and he gave the list. He didn't put a date on it, but he gave a very clear impression this was going to be very soon after a provincial election. We're going to get this done. Okay. And he said, here's how Ottawa has to meet a number of conditions to avoid this. They have to completely overhaul equalization. Mm. We need Trans Mountain built. We need Energy East built. We need Bill C-69 repealed and or rewritten, and Bill C-48 repealed or rewritten. Fast forward.
And sorry, Derek, can I just interject? Just for the audience, can you give us a synopsis?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, those are essentially the anti-pipeline bill and the tanker ban moratorium bill. So as time went on and get into the election, started watering things down a bit. Now we're at the point where the premier has effectively, more or less, taken equalization off the table and replaced it with what he's dubbed an equalization rebate, the so-called Fiscal Stabilization Fund.
Right.
This is not an equalization rebate. It's not designed to be one. It has nothing to do with equalization. All provinces are eligible for it if they get equalization or not. He's talking about reforming that with some retroactive payments. So Alberta sends more than $20 billion a year net, more to Ottawa than we get back.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Thievery. Yeah, pure thievery. Well, actually, British Columbia is a net contributor.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
Not by a large amount, but it's a net contributor. So you don't have to thank us. Quebec.
No. Yeah.
So we send trains, we send pipelines of money every year, and we're not even going to try and fix that anymore. Now we're just going to settle for $1.5 to $2.5 billion one-time payment from Ottawa to make us go away. Mm. There's no talk of Energy East anymore. There's no talk of repealing Bill C-69 or C-48. They're talking about just being nicer about the application of the regulations around it. All of these conditions have been dropped. equalization's just been replaced with this rebate business, and TMX, I think, is actually going to get built. So using my crystal ball here, what I fear is happening is he is moving the goalpost back, because he knows there's just no way Ottawa is even under the Tories, there was no way we were going to get any of these, most of these things. At least we would repeal the two anti-pipeline and tanker bills,
right?
But that would be it.
Yeah.
So he's moving the goalposts so that he'll be able to say, "I won on equalization." No, he won't. He will have gotten a one-time cash payout.
Sure.
And then we've got TMX, but no Energy East, no anything else.
Right.
And there'll be no more pipelines ever built again under current legislation in Canada. So he wants to, I think, be able to declare victory, say, I stood up to Ottawa and I got us a fair deal. It's not perfect. It's not everything we want, but it's good enough. And he's hoping that that will calm people down. Among hardcore partisans who tend to believe anything their party says, probably will.
Right.
But I don't think it's going to put enough of a wet blanket on the fire that he has been fanning for 3 years straight.
Do you think that there's a case to be made about incrementalism? You know, I mean, he is a Harper, prodigy, right? And so, Harper was always big on incremental. You know, we make some small changes, and this is the beginning. You know, reelect me, continue to put me in, and I'll continue to make those incremental changes. Or do you think there's just hard stops on some of those things?
Well, with all respect to Harper, his incrementalism failed miserably. He had a decade in power. We ran the biggest deficits in the history of the country so we could maintain the confidence in a minority parliament in this incrementalism. We ended up owning some bloody car companies, costing us a boatload of money. We end up with a smaller military than we did when he took power. And
he was still, according to the left, by the way, the most extreme right wing.
Oh, yeah. He's still portrayed as Genghis Khan. He does all of these things. I stopped voting. I couldn't vote for him by his last election because I only ever voted for Stephen Harper because I believed there was a hidden agenda. It turned out there was no hidden agenda. And as soon as I figured that out, I said, I'm out. I can't vote for this shit anymore.
It's interesting, though, right? Because you and I had huge amounts of trouble with Harper in the end because he wasn't being conservative enough. Yet there was still these extremely loud voices in Canada that he was just the most awful right wing.
They'll do that. They did it against Scheer.
So frustrating.
Scheer, who's owned by the dairy lobby and who campaigned on keeping the CBC and equalization, all these things. They'll say that no matter what. So you may as well actually just stand by your principles from time to time. But no, Harper's incrementalism approach didn't get very much done in office. In fact, we went backwards on many issues.
Sure.
We went incrementally in the wrong direction. And then the few things we did get, we're undone in the first 6 months of the Trudeau government anyway. So we got nothing out of the entire thing. So
isn't it different in Alberta, though, because Alberta is historically very, very rarely voted for anything other than the conservative, in name only perhaps, but conservative option on the ballot. And so there's a lower risk around the incrementalism?
Well, provincially, I mean, they're making some pretty bold changes in, I think, a positive direction, at least in some cases. And in other cases, they're pretty tepid. But when it comes to the Alberta or the Western question about Alberta getting a fair deal and Saskatchewan getting a fair deal, I don't think incrementalism is really the way to go. I think you've got the energy right now. You've got public support for it. I think it's very clear that we need to put forward a whole package of reforms, of constitutional reforms. So forget this equalization referendum 2 years from now. Let's hold a referendum in 6 months from now on a whole package of constitutional demands for Senate reform, for market access, for outlawing equalization, these things. And we send it to Ottawa and the other provinces. And if we can get that deal, then frankly, I mean, even those who are supportive of independence, most of them will acknowledge that we could probably live with this, even if it's not great. Even if we're outvoted often, we should be protected enough within a federation. But if, as I would expect, Ottawa rejects it, Quebec rejects it, then I think Alberta would be wise then to hold a second vote on independence. And at that time, I think people will be off the fence about believing reform is possible, which is why all comes down to why I don't think Jason Kenney's equalization referendum is ever going to get held. Because if we hold that referendum, we're going to vote 80 to 85% for it. We're going to send it to Ottawa almost unanimously. And Ottawa is going to tell us to pound sand. Sure. And then Albertans are going to be left with two options. And Jason Kenney does not like those two options, surrendering or independence.
Right.
He wants to be somewhere in between that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Wow, quite the dynamics. And of course, Jason Kenney went to Ottawa, had a nice sit-down meeting with our illustrious Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who, is just making us look remarkable on the world stage. We should all be proud. Justin Trudeau's legacy in Canada. I'm kidding, by the way, that's the concerned look on your face.
He has left a black mark.
oh wow.
Hey-o.
So we'll talk about the Prime Minister another time, because it's going to be very hard to play devil's advocate in that one. But yeah, so sat down with him. Nothing in particular. Lots of platitudes. Friendly handshakes. Is this going anywhere? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's pretty different. Rick Bell's column in the Calgary Sun today opened with, and I saw Rick Bell at the Fair Deal panel last night. He was kind of beside himself. He can't believe that he thinks this is a different Jason than he knows. And it's a long way from Jason Kenney comparing Trudeau to the intellectual depth of a finger bowl to what he said yesterday, which is I think that I forget the exact word, but essentially it was cordial, and they had a conversation, and the Prime Minister said he's listening. It wasn't that Rachel Notley fawning like a fangirl over him. I mean, it was nothing so disgusting as that.
Right.
But it was a very different change of tone, and I think feeds very much into what I've been arguing here, which is that Jason Kenney is trying to move the goalposts, make us drop some of these demands that he's been talking about for 3 years, and try to bring the temperature down, because it is so hot right now, at least in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And if he can't get these things that he's been talking about, and I think he must know in his heart, there's no way to get 9/10 of them. Right. And so he's got to manage expectations downwards right now. And that means, if not being warm with the federal government, at least being cordial and cooperative rather than confrontational.
And I push back a little bit on that. I mean, isn't that kind of? I mean, you can't go into a meeting diplomatically with the Prime Minister and have the knife ready to stab into his back. You have to come with some some. I don't know what the word, diplomacy, right? Is probably the best word.
Scott Moe did a couple weeks ago. He went in and met with Trudeau and came out and said the guy has got no idea. He doesn't understand where we are. That's not to say Premier Moe was right and Kenney was wrong, or vice versa. I think. I just wonder, are you going to get anywhere? Right. I mean, if you want to play ball, you have to at least be cordial. And I agree with you. I don't think fawning over him or making unnecessary compliments is the way to go either. But at least be kind to their face. Well, I know. I agree. I mean, when Reagan would meet Gorbachev, and I mean, they've got nukes pointed at each other, but they would still be reasonable, diplomatic, and treat each other as men and equals.
Sure.
And I would expect the Premier of Alberta, regardless of our feelings or his feelings about Trudeau, to do the same.
That's right.
I think that's fine. We don't expect him to go in and flip the couch over and scream.
Yeah.
That's not very productive.
Or wash his feet, or somewhere. It's got to be somewhere in between, right?
Yeah, but the language was radically different from even previous meetings that he's had with Justin Trudeau. And I think this is about trying to lower the temperature and manage expectations downwards, because there is no way that, as much as he might try, there is no way that we are going to get the vast majority of the things that Jason Kenney campaigned on getting from Ottawa.
So if we talked already about managing expectations downward, and I can see. I think you're right. I think that's just the real politic of it, right? But lowering the temperature, I think, is actually probably really sensible. If you want to get things done, you have to lower the temperature a little bit and then get into the meat of it, right?
It depends what you're trying to get done. If you're trying to get a couple of small victories and not let this independence movement get out of control, then that is exactly what you want to do.
Right.
But, if you're a bit spicier and you want wholesale reform, the kind of reform that Jason Kenney campaigned on getting, then that temperature needs to be hot. But he's a smart politician, and he recognizes he's not going to be able to get those things.
Exactly, yeah. And it's style, right? And I think it's style, and it comes back to that incrementalist approach. Jason Kenney is not Derek Fildebrandt. He's got his style, and I think he's being fairly pragmatic about it. I don't know how much he really, like you said, I don't know how much realistically he can get done from his agenda. And I think he's a smart guy. He knows the same thing, right? And so lowering the temperature, having constructive talks, maybe ticking a couple boxes, as politics goes, it's probably a pretty sensible approach at this point.
If there is something Jason Kenney knows, it's politics, and it's this dealing and the whole god awful mess of politics. He's very good at that kind of maneuvering. But it is a question that I can't tell you for sure if it will be enough. Can he manage those expectations downwards? Because if he can't manage those expectations downwards, and people still expect him to deliver what he promised to deliver, he then finds himself in a very dangerous situation politically. If this independence movement in Alberta ever got out of the Legion basement and got organized in any serious way, which it is not yet.
Well, on that note, I think we can wrap up this official first, the Pipeline, our weekly national affairs program. Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard from Calgary. Thank you so much. And I'm Paul Holmes, the digital editor at the Western Standard, coming to you from Victoria, British Columbia. And we will see you next week.